Padma Bhushan, Dr. David Frawley, who is a Vedic astrologer and teacher, an author, and a longtime supporter of the Hindu cause worldwide, is joining us for this exclusive conversation. Dr. Frawley, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you. Very good to be with you.
There's a raging debate going on in India about the reclamation of both Kashi and Mathura after Ayodhya. And I'm sure that you have also seen this debate that is ongoing, because this is the world of social media. In fact, a couple of days ago, you even tweeted that what Aurangzeb did and what his followers may believe today should not decide what happens to sacred sites in India, or even what happened before Aurangzeb. So I want to begin by asking you some of the questions that are always put, and we saw this during the Ram Janmabhoomi movement also, anytime the Hindus try to reclaim these sites. The first question that is asked is, what is the need? Why even go back in history and open up these old wounds? Even if what happened was wrong, why go back in history now? How would you respond to that?
Well, let's go into the history overall. And in the history overall, some of these sites were destroyed more than once. And the fact that they're in the situation they are is an old wound that everybody can see. For example, you can see the part of the temple on the mosque in Kashi. And we also have to understand that India is an independent nation since 1947, of course. Now, prior to that, India was under largely foreign rule in many places. We, of course, know of the British rule, but even under the so-called Islamic rule is largely a Turkish rule, by the way. Most of these people were Turks, whether it was the Delhi Sultanate or the Mughals. So under both of these, Hindus had no rights to reclaim their sacred sites that had been taken because the government was different. And there were many attempts. For example, Ahilya Bai Holkar helped restore Kashi Vishwanath in the late 18th century. And the Marathas restored a lot, like Ujjain. There's a Jyotirlinga there. And the only problem was the British came and took power, I think, by 1818. And so they stopped those processes. So this means that majority Hindus were under minority rule during these Turkish Islamic period and British period. Now, after 1947, majority Hindus are being told that their first duty is to protect the minorities. So in other words, the majority is not protected in the Islamic, British, or now even modern period. So that is the first thing I would have to say. And if we look at other countries, for example, Hungary, Bulgaria, which I've been to many times, Greece and the Balkans, when they got their independence, largely in the early 20th century, they did not stop their sacred sites from coming back. And one more example is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has removed many Turkish mosques, perhaps almost all of them, under the pretext that the Turkish mosques were signs of foreign rule and they were political in nature. Now, if Kashi Vishwanath were a religious site, why was it destroyed so many times? And the other point I would like to bring in here relative to Aurangzeb is his brother, Prince Dara. Dara gave gifts to Mathura. He also translated Upanishads into Persian, which became the basis of all the European translations that came out later, and the Upanishadic revival, Indian philosophical revival that reached Voltaire, Schopenhauer, and so many others. Now, of course, Aurangzeb killed his brother in a battle. The brother was actually the rightful heir to the throne, being the oldest, but he lost that in war. And one of the reasons given by Aurangzeb was that Prince Dara was too favoring the Hindus. And many Hindus also died in the battle along with him. So my question is, maybe we ought to honor Prince Dara's views there and not simply Aurangzeb's views. Shivaji also fought Aurangzeb, as we know. and also the Sikhs did as well. So it was part of India's independence movement also. So why should we honor the figures who are against India's independence simply because of their religious background, even though the work they did or the destruction they did was not an act of piety, it was an act of political domination, humiliate the majority people.
The next question though, the criticism, those who are the critics of this movement, the next question they pose is, how far back will you go? You know, you're talking about 16th, 17th century right now, but where does history stop if you start digging up?
It's a very good question. And one thing we should realize, India is a 5,000-year-old civilization. It has temples, archaeological works, etc., going back all that period, okay, all over the country. So the question is, how do we deal with that? And I would say you need to deal with that at an individual case-by-case basis. You can't have one law that just freezes everything in 1947, because that freezes everything under British rule, more or less. So it should be done individually, case by case. Some may be only archaeological sites. Some may have had a history like Somnath or Kashi Vishwanath of Mathura. In fact, in these cases, the history is well known. There's no dispute about the fact that they were destroyed for largely political reasons. And so because of this, each should be examined separately. And we must then honor India's tradition, because this is not just religion, it's also art, culture, spirituality that has gone into these sites. Now, of course, that's more time consuming than having a blanket law for everything, but I think it needs to be there. And here, let me make another point. I don't believe there is any other country in the world after independence that has created such a law. This law, the Places of Worship Act, I think is unique to India. It doesn't have any legal precedents per se. It certainly was not done by consulting the religious teachers and leaders in India. So I think a new view is required. Examine these on an individual basis. And of course, be receptive. The older they go back, of course, there's maybe less issues about them. But those that are historically known, we need to just remember the fact and see what is going on there. And then I want to mention Pakistan and Bangladesh. They have no such law, and they have not been involved in protecting Hindu sites. A few exceptions may be, but many have gone there. So why should Hindus be penalized in every country, whether they're a minority or a majority, and not able to take back cultural and religious sites, or at least question them and bring them into an independent court view?
You know, you're talking about the politics that governs India. I want to ask you, there is a very particular form of politics in India post-independence, as you mentioned, which puts the burden, I'm using that word specifically, not just the onus, but the burden of secularism on Hindus alone. General feeling is, that is propagated amongst Hindus in India is that, see, you are already larger in number, you are already the majority, so you must not ask for certain things because it may make the minorities, and that particularly refers to Muslims, nervous, right? So the burden of secularism Hindus have begun to feel lies solely on them. The burden to maintain peace, the burden of respect and mutual harmony lies solely with them. So the narrative that has been governing Indian politics for 50, 60 years post-independence is that don't ask for it, that it is wrong to ask for it. Do you believe that this politics has run its course? This kind of politics is no longer going to be acceptable? People have begun to see through it?
It certainly should have run its course. And we must remember, it was born of Nehruvian socialist leftist politics, and they were afraid that a more pro-Hindu government would take them out of power. So it was based on political considerations. And you'll see through the independence period up to today, the same type of alliance, left with minorities against the majority, has been going on. So whether it's right or wrong, it's a political decision. It's not a religious or cultural decision. The next point is Indian secularism is unique. You don't have that secularism in any other country in the world. In the United States, there's equality for all religious groups, including Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and all the rest. There's no special rights for minorities. In fact, I told someone here, in India, if you have a minority religion, you get government benefits. He said, I wish that was happening here because everybody could set up a minority religion in their basement and get government benefits, and they certainly would. So it's increasing the majority-minority divide. And the other point I would like to raise is good governance is not about majority versus minority or minority versus majority. It's about good governance. It's about equality, equal law, uniform civil code. And that is lacking under India's so-called secularism. So that secularism has been exposed, and it is, of course, time to set it aside. I think the current prime minister has done a good job of that. We have to support all communities and not just give favoritism for some group because they happen to be belonging to a certain religion or other group. And I would also like to point out that Hindus in Pakistan have been almost gone. They have very little rights. In Bangladesh, they are often also suppressed. Muslims in India have been treated very well. I'm not saying they've been treated perfectly, but they've been in almost every post except prime minister. So it's not a question of Muslims being specifically mistreated. And the other point I would like to raise, Islam is not a single thing. For example, Saudi has executed many mullahs. They have gone against the Islamic Brotherhood, saying the Islamic Brotherhood is the main source of all trouble in Saudi Arabia. And you have organizations like PFI, Tablighi, and others in India that are part of or connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. Shias are also another group that supported, some of them at least supported Ram Janmabhoomi. So there's no single Islamic view, just as I talked about Aurangzeb and Dara. So we need an integrated society, not just simply increasing these minority and majority divides. Hindus have different sects as well. So a broader view is required. And the old minority secularism was a political vote bank view, not something looking after the welfare or even the progress of the country. India didn't progress very well under the socialist secularists. Some like Lalu Prasad Yadav were borderline warlords rather than democratic leaders. So a new era is required. And we also see that throughout the rest of the world, that we have to honor religions and we should not oppress anyone, but at the same time, there has to be equality and good governance for all.
Well, you're right. This has always been a political thing because the minority vote bank was sought to be used as a vote bank that can function as a veto almost as far as the Hindu side is concerned or the majority is concerned. I want to ask you, we hear a lot of chatter in India at least about Hinduism, about Hindutva, and the distinction between Hinduism and Hindutva. And we also hear some commentary globally that is often cited in India that condemns Hindutva and seeks to separate Hindutva from Hinduism. Now, you are based in US. I want to understand from you, how does the world, or at least let's say people in US, actually view Hinduism and even Hindutva? What is their basic understanding of these two terms?
Well, first of all, 90% of the Americans have never heard of Hindutva, and they can't even explain what Hinduism is. And we found out recently many couldn't even locate Ukraine on a map. So let's forget about the masses. Now, relative to New York Times and Washington Post, they have been anti-India all along, not simply anti-Hindutva. And they've also had distortions. I'll give you one which you can look up. When Babri Masjid was taken down in India, New York Times referred to that as Hindus destroying the oldest mosque in India. It's not the oldest mosque, was never the oldest mosque in India. So these groups are a different group. They represent a certain leftist group and anti-Indian, also pro-Pakistan. They've also done a lot of editorial views from Pakistani prime ministers more so. And you have to remember that Pakistan was a state that was set up and supported by the United States militarily and economically. Pakistan economy is still run by the military. So there were certain vested interests there. The other point here, in the Bangladesh war, United States and Kissinger and Nixon supported Pakistan and even threatened India. However, the Kennedys, Ted Kennedy and the Democrats were more in favor of India. Now, what we have in America today is the Hindus, Indians in general, Hindus in particular, are the most affluent, well-educated, and peaceful organization. You don't find Hindus in jail. You don't find Hindus attacking other groups. You don't find them living on welfare and all of that. That has had a twofold effect. One, to honor Hindus more. Secondly, however, to create a certain jealousy about Hindus. It used to be said in the West that Hindus were poor, uneducated, and superstitious. Now we read groups saying that Hindus have too much money, they have too much power in the business world, and you find them in too many positions of power. So we see both of these views there. And I have to say, unfortunately, the various groups representing the anti-Hindu forces, whether it's advocacy groups, are better organized than the Hindu groups. There's a very good Hindu group here called the Hindu American Foundation as a political advocacy group. But I have to say that globally, I don't think there's another group like them. And yet we have political advocacy groups for many more for Sikhs, not to mention Muslims, Jews. And in America, the Jewish community has taken up an alliance with the Hindu community because they're often criticized now for similar reasons. And then, of course, there are beautiful Hindu temples, many by the Swaminarayan movement in cities of America. And there are people practicing yoga, mantras, having gurus. So that part of Hinduism is known. So there is some political fallout from a certain group, but even you can have pictures, sometimes they show a picture of Modi with Trump. But yet you can have pictures of Modi with Biden, with Obama, with Harris, with Macron, with Merkel. He's gotten awards from the governments of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, Bangladesh, and so forth. So a certain part of the media is blowing that out of proportion. And sometimes they have academic connections. For example, American academics created an anti-Hindutva forum, and they bring in Kavita Krishna, who is one of the main spokesmen of the Marxist-Leninist Revolutionary Party of India. And they nowhere mentioned that she was a Marxist or a communist. So this is an ongoing consideration. And we also have to see that India is rising globally in terms of the foreign relations and working with other nations, whether it's the Quad, whether it's India's respect throughout Europe. So there will be some criticism there, but overall, India is rising, and the accomplishments of the Hindu population worldwide have to be recognized. And in the last British election, the Hindus organized themselves for voting, and they dismissed a lot of these anti-Hindu members of parliament. So this is the movement for the future, we hope.
But according to you, what is the difference between Hinduism and Hindutva? A lot of the Hindu scholars here say there is no difference. This is an artificial difference that is being created just to use Hindutva as a stick to beat the Hindu community with. Or there is a certain section which will say that Hindutva is the Hinduism that resists, that fights back. Is there a difference between Hinduism and Hindutva, according to you?
Well, first of all, there are many groups that can call themselves Hindu because there's no official, you might say, belief creed. So almost anybody can say that. So we have people like Shashi Tharoor talking about being a Hindu, but most of his book is about criticizing other Hindus rather than defining what Hindu Dharma is. Hinduism also has many names: Sanatana Dharma, Manava Dharma, Moksha Dharma, Arya Dharma, many names through history. It has many sub-pradayas with various different views. And it has a very open view because the goal in the Hindu Dharma is union with the divine and self-realization for all. It is not simply creating a belief. Historically, Hindus have always resisted, whether it was Shivaji, whether it was the Rana Pratap, whether it was even, not just the Marathas, even in the 19th century. They called it the First War of Independence, but I say it was a continuation of the war against the British. The British only gained power in India by they didn't defeat the Sikhs until 1849, the Marathas in 1818. And so 1857, a lot of the same people were there. And Hinduism has the Kshatriya Dharma. Read the Gita and the Mahabharata, read the Ramayana, study the Puranas and the Vedas. Hinduism has every right to resist because it is the largest religion in the world today that is massively targeted for conversion. Billions of dollars go into that, including, I've seen all my Hindu friends in the West have been targeted by someone going to their children also for conversion. We know the big I call it the multi-billion-dollar multinational conversion industry, which has also come to India and other countries. They're also targeting Buddhists as well. So that is a fact. So Hinduism have the right, if you can have the right to criticize Hindus, they also have the right to criticize you. There's this famous quote of Mahatma Gandhi. They asked him what he thought of Western civilization. And he said he thought it would be a good idea. He also said that when they said India should be more like the British, and he said the British had to exploit 3/4 of the globe to create their empire. How many globes would India have to exploit in order to become like the British? So a Hindu voice is needed in dialogue, and we don't always find it there. And Hindus have their point of view. They can criticize religious intolerance, religious violence, etc. But also the Hindu view is simply to bring people together and to connect to a higher reality. So this is an artificial divide, and it's trying to remove any Hindu activism as being Hindutva and wrong by people themselves who are activists against the Hindus. And that has been going on for some time. And you'll also see this narrative is being created by the radical left, the communists, the Marxists, and often the support of the Congress Party allied with the communists in Bengal and used them to write their textbooks years ago. So I think it's an artificial divide. And the last point I want to make here, Hindus globally, and even in India, are probably the least politically active of any religious group. If you see the amount of Islamic, Christian, even Sikh activists globally, you'll see Hindus tend to not vote or not push candidates. And my point is very clear. Voting is the currency of today. If you don't vote, you don't get recognition or support by the government or anyone else. And when Hindus voted in UK, the government took notice. Otherwise, in countries like the United States, Hindus have more money and more positions of power, but there's generally more of a support for the Muslims because they vote more in mass rather than as individual groups. So we need a Hindu activism. You don't necessarily have to call it Hindutva. This term may be defined in different ways by different people, but certainly Hindu activism is required. And take someone like Savarkar. who they attribute the term Hindutva for. He was a great patriot. He wasn't a figure of the right wing, by the way. He was an anarchist. He was with the left. And he was a very egalitarian person in his views. So we have to look at the history as a whole, but it is more a fear of Hindu activism than any real Hindu violence going on. We really don't see that. In fact, Hindus often don't do a good enough job protecting themselves.
Interesting. This is purely to ensure that Hindu activism does not rise, and they continue to have once again the burden of their actions, even though Hindu violence, if there is anything like that, is not at all comparable to violence, for example, of any other religion throughout history and even till today. But in India, there is a whole narrative that there is a militant form of Hinduism, that Hindus are violent, the Hindus are militant. I have lots to talk to you about, but I have to end this conversation. So I just want to finally ask you, because we started with the Gyanvapi and Mathura issue, both are in court now. What do you think, or what is your hope will happen? Do you think, quite like Ayodhya, Gyanvapi, Kashi and Mathura can also be quote unquote reclaimed?
Well, certainly the historical and archaeological issues raised against Ayodhya cannot be made against Kashi Vishwanath or Mathura. That is very clear. And we do have to revisit this places of worship law and not make it retroactive. That is incorrect. And I think they will change over time because it is quite obvious. And let us make it clear. These are also figures of Indian culture, Krishna, Ram. So they need their place and history, and Shiva, the great lord of yoga, also needs to be honored.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. David Frawley.